The sea was calm that morning and unnaturally calm. It was late 1944, somewhere east of Leyte Gulf. The horizon shimmered in heat and oil haze, broken only by the distant hum of engines. On the decks of American warships, sailors squinted into the rising sun. They had learned to fear that sound. The slow, gathering roar of Japanese aircraft closing in, coming low. Too low for traditional anti-aircraft guns to track. The first Zero appeared from the clouds, banking sharply, sunlight flashing across its wings. It dove, straight for the destroyer line. Gunners opened fire. Tracer rounds arced wildly, missing, exploding uselessly in empty sky. Then something new happened. One shell detonated mid-air. Not on contact, not by chance, but precisely as the plane passed within its invisible reach. A blinding burst. The Zero vanished in a bloom of smoke and shredded metal, falling apart before it could even begin its dive. Seconds later, another detonation. And another. The sky filled with fragments of aircraft and flickering light. A deadly curtain that seemed to think for itself. Below deck, men looked at each other in disbelief. They didn't yet know the name for what had saved them. But history would. The proximity fuse. The Pacific War had reached its cruel crescendo by late 1944. Japan's once mighty empire was shrinking under relentless American assault. Island by island, base by base, the U.S. Navy and Marines clawed their way westward, from Guadalcanal to Saipan, then toward the Philippines. Each victory brought them closer to the Japanese homeland. Each battle, however, came at a devastating cost. By now, Japan had turned desperation into strategy. With their navy crippled and air strength diminished, the Imperial Command unleashed a new weapon: men willing to die. Kamikaze pilots, young, barely trained, often underfed, were sent to crash their planes directly into Allied ships. They flew low, fast, and unpredictable. Traditional anti-aircraft defenses were nearly powerless to stop them. Shells designed to explode on impact failed if they missed by mere meters. Firing more only filled the air with chaos and smoke. For the men aboard American ships, every siren meant a test of luck. Could they hit a target diving at 400 miles per hour before it struck their decks? In the autumn of 1944, hundreds of sailors died answering that question. The Battle of Leyte Gulf alone saw waves of suicide planes tear through the fleet, smashing into carriers and destroyers, setting the sea ablaze with burning fuel. The U.S. Navy's gunners fought back bravely. Bofors and Oerlikon cannons spat fire at the sky. But the physics of the fight were against them. A near miss meant nothing. If a shell exploded 10 feet away, the kamikaze kept coming. It would take something extraordinary, something invisible, to turn the tide. That answer had been in secret development for years, under top-level classification, shared only between the U.S. and Britain. Its name was simple, but its concept was revolutionary: the proximity fuse. Instead of waiting to hit the target, it detonated itself when it approached one. Inside a shell no larger than a man's forearm lay a miniature radar system, a fragile, impossibly complex circuit that could sense its own death radius. This technology was born from a strange union of physics and desperation. In 1940, before America even entered the war, British scientists working under the Tizard mission shared their early research on radio wave detection with their American counterparts. The British had pioneered radar, but miniaturization seemed impossible. How could one fit such precision into a shell that experienced over 20,000 Gs of force when fired? Yet a team at the Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory believed it could be done. Under the leadership of Dr. Merle Tuve, engineers and physicists began to build what they jokingly called the shell that could think. They used vacuum tubes smaller than a thumb, powered by miniature batteries that could survive shock and vibration. Every time a shell fired, its tiny radio brain woke for a fraction of a second, sent out electromagnetic waves, and waited for their echo to bounce off an aircraft. If it detected reflection within the correct range, the circuit would instantly detonate the explosive payload. By late 1942, test results were astonishing. Over the Chesapeake Bay, target drones were shot down with unprecedented precision. What had once required dozens of rounds now needed only a few. Still, secrecy was paramount. President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill personally classified the fuse's existence as more secret than the atomic bomb. If the Axis discovered how it worked, they could easily adapt their countermeasures or worse, copy it. So the project continued in total silence. Thousands of workers at General Electric, Raytheon, and Crosley built the delicate mechanisms by hand. Each component had to function flawlessly. Even a single broken solder joint meant failure. Women technicians working in hidden facilities across the U.S. assembled millions of Fuze without ever being told what they truly were. By the time the first batches reached the Pacific Fleet in 1944, the Allies had already tested them successfully in Europe, over Antwerp and during the Battle of the Bulge, where proximity-fused artillery shells devastated advancing German infantry. But now the Navy needed them for a different purpose. Japanese aircraft were hitting harder than ever, and American ships desperately needed a weapon that could protect them in those final, grueling months of the war. Admiral William Halsey's fleet would be among the first to deploy the technology. The challenge, however, was not just in manufacturing or design. It was in trust. Many officers were skeptical of the Fuze's reliability at sea. The Pacific's humidity, salt air, and shock waves could easily destroy its fragile circuits. And yet there was no choice left. The Japanese were flying suicide missions in waves hundreds strong. Even the mighty Essex-class carriers could not sustain those attacks forever. When the first shipments of proximity-fused shells reached forward bases like Ulithi and Leyte, the sailors who loaded them into their guns didn't fully understand what made them special. They were told only one thing: aim near the target. The rest, the weapon would handle on its own. And soon enough they would see it for themselves. The first time proximity fuses were used in real combat at sea, the men watching didn't believe what they were seeing. The order came quietly through the chain of command. New shells. Handle carefully. No technical briefings. No manuals. Just quiet confidence from the officers who'd seen the test reports. On the deck of a U.S. destroyer escorting the fleet near Luzon, a gun crew fitted the new 5-inch rounds into the breech. The sky above was scattered with clouds, and the sound of engines began again. That deep, trembling hum the sailors had come to dread. Japanese aircraft were approaching low over the waves. A dozen of them. Kamikazes armed with 500-pound bombs and a death wish. The gun captain called the range. 3,000 yards, the guns opened up. Tracers flared upward in long arcs. And then, astonishingly, explosions began to erupt near the planes, not on them. Each detonation seemed to find its mark in midair. The gunners watched pieces of wings shear off, cockpits burst apart, engines flame out. The enemy formation collapsed before it ever reached firing range. The men didn't cheer. They simply stared, stunned. It was like the sky itself had turned against their attackers. For the Japanese pilots, the experience was equally surreal. They were used to dodging flak, predictable bursts easily avoided. But this was different. They flew through what appeared to be empty air, only for their planes to disintegrate without warning. Fuses, wings, and fuel tanks tore away as if struck by invisible shrapnel. Pilots shouted warnings that came too late. New shells. Exploding near us. But by then, the Pacific was already littered with burning wreckage. This was the beginning of a new kind of warfare, one built on precision through invisible science. The proximity fuse worked on principles that sounded almost like science fiction in 1944. Each shell carried a miniature transmitter that emitted a radio signal as it spun through the air. When that signal bounced back off an aircraft within a preset range, usually around 70 feet, it triggered instant detonation. The blast shredded wings and fuselages with fragments of steel, turning near misses into fatal hits. Unlike contact fuses, it didn't need to strike. Unlike timed fuses, it didn't rely on guessing the target's altitude. It thought in its own way, calculating distance and reacting automatically. For the U.S. Navy's gunners, this changed everything. They no longer had to fill the sky with random fire. Now their weapons could do the thinking for them. Within weeks of deployment, reports began to flood into Washington and Pearl Harbor. Carrier groups under repeated attack were emerging unscathed. Destroyers that had once been kamikaze magnets were suddenly surviving full assault waves. But it wasn't only sailors who saw the difference. On nearby islands, Marine artillery units began to receive proximity-fused rounds for use against low-flying aircraft. The results were devastating. One Marine battery commander later wrote, "It was like swatting flies with lightning." Behind this battlefield success, however, lay an immense industrial effort. Over 200 million vacuum tubes had been produced by American factories by 1945, each tiny, each tested, each hand-assembled. The process required precision work from tens of thousands of civilians, many of them women. They worked under heavy secrecy, told only that their parts were for radar. In reality, they were assembling the hidden heart of the most advanced fuse in military history. The proximity fuse was so effective that it began to alter Japanese tactics within months. Air groups that once attacked in large formations began to split into smaller, faster, more erratic waves to avoid mass targeting. But it didn't matter. The weapon didn't need to aim. It simply waited, and as long as it sensed motion in the sky, destruction followed. By early 1945, during the approach to Okinawa, entire kamikaze raids were being annihilated before they reached the American fleet. The gunners could see the effect in real time. Fiery debris raining into the sea, pilots ejecting too late, burning wrecks skipping across the waves. For the Japanese Navy, already in ruins, this was psychological devastation. Pilots had once considered themselves unstoppable instruments of the Emperor's will. Now they were dying in invisible fields of energy they couldn't understand. Some survivors reported that shells seemed to know where they were. A chilling myth born from what was, in fact, cutting-edge physics. Meanwhile, Allied commanders realized the full scale of what they possessed. A weapon so secret that even the crews using it didn't fully grasp its science. Yet so decisive it was changing the entire dynamic of Pacific combat. In Tokyo, Japanese intelligence analysts began intercepting reports of increased American anti-air accuracy. They suspected radar-guided weapons but couldn't prove it. The Imperial Army tried experimenting with radio jammers, but none could interfere with the ultra-short wavelengths used by the proximity fuse. It remained untouchable. The Allies guarded the secret fiercely. Fuse shells were never fired over enemy land, to prevent recovery and analysis. Any dud found floating after a battle was ordered destroyed by gunfire or depth charge. The technology was simply too valuable to risk. Even within the U.S. military, knowledge of the fuse's details was compartmentalized. Only a handful of officers in the Pacific Theater truly understood how it worked. To the rest, it was almost mystical, the miracle that stopped death in midair, and that miracle was about to reach its greatest test: Okinawa. The largest, most intense kamikaze assault of the war, the battle where proximity fuses would decide whether hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men lived or died. The Battle of Okinawa began on April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday. To the Americans, it was the final and bloodiest step before reaching Japan itself. The island stretched only 60 miles long, but its defense would become one of the fiercest campaigns of the Pacific War. For the Japanese, Okinawa was sacred ground, their last shield before the home islands. But while soldiers fought on land, the sky became a battlefield of its own. In the weeks leading to the invasion, Japanese High Command unleashed a storm of suicide attacks unlike anything the Allies had faced before. It was called Operation Tengo, Heavenly Operation. Nearly 2,000 aircraft, from sleek Zeros to obsolete trainers packed with explosives, were ordered to throw themselves at the American fleet. They flew in waves day and night, guided only by courage and desperation. The Allied task force stretched over hundreds of miles, 2,500 ships of every class. Battleships, carriers, destroyers, hospital ships, all exposed beneath open sky. For every kamikaze destroyed, more seemed to appear on the horizon. The sailors knew what to expect: the sound of engines, the shriek of diving planes, and the impact that could tear a ship apart in seconds. But this time, something had changed. When the first kamikaze waves approached, American gunners opened fire using their new secret weapon, proximity-fused shells. The sky over Okinawa erupted into a wall of invisible precision. Each shell detonated just near enough to fill the air with lethal shrapnel, cutting through the wings and cockpits of oncoming aircraft before they could begin their dives. From a distance, it looked like chaos, clouds of black smoke, flak bursts and burning planes falling by the dozen. But to those on the ships, it was pure relief. They could see it working. At 10:30 a.m., the USS Brain, a destroyer on radar picket duty, was attacked by 6 suicide planes. 2 broke through the screen. 1 crashed into her stern, killing dozens. Yet the others never made it. Gunners reported that their proximity rounds burst right beside the incoming Zeros, shredding them mid-air before they reached striking range. The sea boiled with fragments of wreckage. Elsewhere, the USS Missouri, one of the Navy's largest battleships, faced a kamikaze diving straight at her bridge. Her gunners fired a burst of shells fitted with the new fuses. The plane disintegrated less than 50 yards away, scattering debris across her decks. The ship's captain later remarked that the weapon had saved the Missouri from certain impact. By mid-April, proximity-fused ammunition was standard issue for all frontline ships. The change in survival rates was dramatic. During earlier campaigns like Lady Gulf, a single kamikaze wave could sink multiple destroyers. Now, despite thousands of attacks the fleet endured, ships were damaged but fewer were lost. For the first time, the U.S. Navy had gained dominance not just through armor or aircraft, but through unseen intelligence embedded in every shell. To the Japanese pilots, the sky over Okinawa became a graveyard. Their approach paths, once carefully planned, now meant nothing. The invisible sensors inside American shells detected them long before they could dive. The air itself seemed alive, filled with explosions triggered by their own movement. Some described the sensation as flying through a sea of lightning. By May, Japan had lost nearly 1,500 aircraft to proximity-fused defenses. Those who watched from the ground saw what looked like black storms hovering over the fleet, waves of flak that followed the attackers wherever they went. American destroyers, once kamikaze magnets, became floating fortresses of automatic death. Even the Imperial Japanese Navy's last major sortie, the doomed mission of Yamato, the world's largest battleship, felt the weapon's reach. When American carrier aircraft found her off Kyushu, the supporting kamikaze squadrons that tried to cover her were torn apart by flak screens using proximity fuses. The result was catastrophic. The Yamato went down without ever striking back, and her escort planes fell into the sea, victims of unseen detonations they could neither evade nor comprehend. The Japanese command tried everything: low-level night raids, single-plane infiltrations, even decoy clouds of smoke. But the proximity fuse didn't care. It didn't rely on light or timing. It sensed motion, reflection, and distance. In darkness or daylight, rain or haze, it worked. On board U.S. ships, the gunners' faith in their equipment transformed into confidence. Where once there was fear, now there was rhythm, the measured pulse of calculated defense. They called the sky their iron umbrella. Sailors began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could survive long enough to see Japan's surrender. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, more than 1,900 Japanese planes had been shot down. Over half of those kills were credited directly to proximity-fused ammunition. It wasn't just an improvement in weaponry, it was a revolution in warfare. The balance of the air-sea battlefield had been rewritten, not by numbers but by circuitry small enough to fit in a man's palm. But the story didn't end there. The success of the proximity fuse at Okinawa rippled outward, into strategy meetings in Washington, into Allied intelligence circles, and even into the Manhattan Project, where engineers marveled at how invisible science could end visible destruction. And soon, as the world prepared for Japan's final stand, the proximity fuse would play one last, quiet role, one that shaped the outcome of the war's last chapter. The guns finally fell silent over Okinawa in June 1945. What remained was devastation: mountains of twisted steel, scorched earth, and seas still slick with oil and debris. The battle had cost more than 200,000 lives, soldiers and civilians alike. Yet amid the ruin, a quiet realization spread through the Allied ranks. Something new had changed the nature of war itself. The proximity fuse had not just protected ships, it had altered the psychology of combat. Sailors who once braced for death with every incoming engine roar were now calm, disciplined, confident. Officers described it as fighting with intelligence instead of panic. For the first time, flak batteries could think faster than human reflexes. The fear that had haunted every naval gunner since 1941 began to fade. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reviewing the fleet's battle reports, noted the extraordinary kill ratios. Kamikaze attacks that once claimed 3 or 4 ships per wave now barely managed to damage one. It was as if the sky itself had turned against Japan. Intelligence summaries sent to Washington credited the fuse with saving countless thousands of lives. President Truman later called it one of the three great scientific developments of the war, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. For Japan, the consequences were equally profound. Pilots continued to launch suicide missions even after Okinawa, but their impact was blunted. They could no longer strike terror with certainty. By the summer of 1945, the once feared kamikaze had become a symbol of futility, a tragic echo of earlier fanaticism meeting an invisible wall of science. Captured Japanese officers, interrogated after the war, expressed disbelief when shown the weapon's inner workings. "We thought it was magic," one pilot said. "How could a shell know we were there?" Others refused to believe it was real, insisting it must have been some form of radar-guided artillery from shore or shipboard fire control. To men who had fought by instinct and courage, the idea of radio waves inside a bullet was beyond comprehension. In the United States, the people who had built the proximity fuse began to learn what their work had achieved. Workers at factories in Baltimore, Cincinnati, and Bridgeport, most of them women, were finally told that the delicate tubes they had assembled had saved ships and crews across the Pacific. Many had no idea they had been part of one of the war's most classified projects. When the secrecy was lifted in August 1945, newspapers called the fuse the little brain that won the war. At the same time, Allied scientists reflected on what had been accomplished. The proximity fuse had demonstrated not only technological brilliance but the triumph of collaboration. British innovation had merged with American industrial power and academic genius. Physicists, engineers, soldiers, and assembly line workers had together created something that defied traditional boundaries. It was the first true marriage of science and warfare on a massive scale, a foreshadowing of what was coming with the nuclear age. When Japan finally surrendered in September 1945, the proximity fuse had already spread into nearly every branch of the Allied arsenal. Artillery units in Europe had used it to shatter German troop concentrations during the Battle of the Bulge. The Navy had perfected it against air attacks. The Army Air Forces had begun adapting it for air-to-air and anti-submarine depth charges. By war's end, nearly 22 million fuse units had been produced, a feat of mass production rivaled only by the aircraft and tanks they protected. But perhaps the most remarkable effect of all was invisible, a shift in how wars would be fought forever after. For centuries, artillery had relied on human timing and mechanical precision. The proximity fuse changed that. It introduced automation, reaction, and feedback, the foundation of modern guided weapons. It was the ancestor of the smart bomb, the missile interceptor, and the radar-guided defense system. Still, to those who used it, the memory was personal. On ships anchored off Japan in the final weeks before the surrender, sailors cleaned their guns one last time. The same men who had once flinched at the sight of diving aircraft now stared out at a quiet horizon. They didn't know how the war would end, only that something small, unseen, had helped them survive to see it. In one after-action report from the destroyer USS Leutze, a gunner's mate wrote a single line that captured it all. "We never saw it coming, and they never saw it coming either." It was a grim kind of symmetry, the new face of warfare, science and destruction fused together in silence. The proximity fuse's legacy was immediate and lasting. In post-war debriefings, General George S. Patton called it one of the greatest killers of the war. Admiral Nimitz credited it with making the fleet nearly invulnerable in its final push toward Japan. And Dr. Merle Tuve, the physicist who had led its creation, quietly returned to academic life, refusing to take personal credit. When asked about his invention's impact, he simply replied, "We gave our sailors a fighting chance." That chance became the line between survival and annihilation. But the proximity fuse was more than a weapon. It was a message that science could end fear, that knowledge could defend life as much as it destroyed it. And as the war ended, humanity faced a new question. Where would that knowledge lead next? In the quiet that followed the war's end, the proximity fuse became a symbol of a new world, one where human thought and mechanical precision had merged into something far greater than anyone imagined. It wasn't loud or glorious like the atomic bomb, nor iconic like the B-29 or the Sherman tank. It was invisible, a silent revolution, born not from power but from precision. To those who had fought beneath its protection, it represented survival. Thousands of sailors, gunners, and pilots owed their lives to a tiny device no bigger than a light bulb, buried inside a steel shell. To the engineers and physicists who had built it proved that intellect could shape the outcome of battles once ruled by chaos and chance. It had turned the tide not with destruction alone, but with understanding. It showed that war was no longer just about courage or numbers. It was about minds, about the quiet laboratories, the sleepless nights, the steady hands soldering tiny circuits in secret rooms. The proximity fuse became the ancestor of every modern weapon that could think, react, and adapt. From radar-guided missiles to automated defense systems, its DNA runs through every piece of smart technology that followed. It was the bridge between the age of industrial warfare and the digital battlefield that would define the next century. Yet for all its brilliance, it carried a sobering truth, that once science and war were united, they would never separate again. The invisible intelligence that saved lives over Okinawa would within months help guide the atomic bombs that ended the war entirely. Humanity had crossed a threshold. From now on, knowledge itself would be as dangerous as any weapon. In black and white footage from 1945, you can still see the faces of the sailors watching the sky, calm, focused, unaware that they were witnessing the dawn of an entirely new kind of warfare. Their guns had learned to think. The machines had begun to listen. And as peace returned to the Pacific, one thing became clear. The proximity fuse was more than a device. It was a glimpse into the future. Proof that even in the darkest years of war, the spark of human ingenuity could shine brighter than the flames it created.